There are names that feel like thunder. When spoken aloud, they carry weight, danger, and an air of legend. Names that do not simply belong to people, but to entire eras. One of those names is Pablo Escobar. To some, he was a Robin Hood man who built homes for the poor, who gave money to children, who turned the slums of Medellín into neighborhoods with running water and electricity. To others, he was a monster, a ruthless killer whose empire was built on blood, fear, and cocaine. He was loved and hated, admired and despised, all at once. At the height of his power in the 1980s, Escobar was not just rich. He was one of the richest men on earth. Forbes magazine listed him among the wealthiest billionaires, his fortune estimated at over $30 billion in today's money. His Medellín Cartel supplied 80% of the world's cocaine, making him not just a criminal, but a king on the global stage. But behind the money, behind the mansions and the private zoos, was a man who ruled through terror. Judges assassinated, politicians bombed, entire airplanes destroyed just to eliminate a single enemy. He was not just a drug dealer. He was a warlord. Even today, decades after his death, the name Pablo Escobar sparks heated debate. For some Colombians, he remains the man who gave back to the poor when the government ignored them. For others, his name is spoken only with pain, as a reminder of car bombs, assassinations, and years when no one felt safe walking the streets of Medellín. That is why his story grips us. Because it is not a simple story of crime. It is a story of contradictions, of a man who built an empire of cocaine and bought his way into the hearts of the people, even as he tore a country apart. So how does a boy from the poor neighborhoods of Medellín rise to become the king of cocaine, feared by presidents and pursued by the most powerful government in the world? How does someone who started by stealing cars and selling fake lottery tickets end up commanding armies of sicarios, dictating terms to his nation, and becoming an international legend? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, did Escobar believe he was doing good, or was his generosity nothing more than a mask for blood and greed? To understand Escobar, you must first understand Colombia in the mid-20th century. This was a country of beauty and violence, a nation blessed with mountains, rivers, and coffee, but cursed with inequality and political unrest. In the slums of Medellín, children grew up barefoot, with empty stomachs, watching the wealthy live lives they could never touch. For a boy like Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria, born in 1949 to a farmer and a schoolteacher, the message was clear. The system was not built for him. If he wanted more, he would have to take it. And take it he did. Escobar wasn't handsome in the traditional sense. He was short, stocky, with a thick mustache and piercing eyes. But he had something far more powerful: charm. From a young age, he knew how to persuade, how to negotiate, how to make people believe in him. Whether it was friends on the street, corrupt police officers, or entire communities, Escobar understood the art of winning loyalty. He combined this charm with a willingness to do whatever it took. If kindness worked, he used kindness. If violence was required, he used violence without hesitation. This duality, the smiling benefactor and the ruthless killer, was what made him unstoppable. Escobar's story is not just Colombian history. It is global history. His empire changed the way the world understood drugs, crime, and power. He redefined what it meant to be a criminal. He showed that with enough money and fear, one man could challenge entire governments, bend the law to his will, and force even the United States to dedicate its full strength to hunting him down. But just like Al Capone before him, Escobar's story is also a lesson. Because for all his wealth and power, his empire was built on sand. The same violence that made him king also made him vulnerable. And the same people who once saw him as a hero eventually turned against him. This is not simply a story of cocaine. It is the story of ambition without limits. A man who reached for the world and nearly held it in his hands, only to watch it slip through his fingers. It is a story of how power can corrupt, how generosity can be twisted into manipulation, and how fear can hold a nation hostage. And it all begins with a boy in Medellín, a boy who looked at poverty and said, "Not me, not forever." That boy grew into a man who would make billions, kill thousands, and die on a rooftop, running from the law. His name was Pablo Escobar, and this is his story. Pablo Emilio Escobar Gaviria was not born into wealth, but into hunger, dust, and ambition. He came into the world on December 1st, 1949, in the rugged hills outside Medellín, Colombia. His father, Abel, was a farmer. His mother, Hermilda, was a schoolteacher. They were honest, hard-working people. But in Colombia at that time, honesty rarely paid the bills. The Escobars lived in poverty, part of a struggling lower class. The divide between rich and poor was a canyon, and young Pablo could see both sides. He walked past crumbling shacks in the barrios, then looked down the road at gleaming neighborhoods where politicians, bankers, and elites lived behind walls. This contrast planted something in him, an unwillingness to accept the fate handed to him at birth. He wouldn't remain poor. He wouldn't live invisible. He wanted more, and he would do whatever it took to get it. As a child, Pablo was restless, sharp-eyed, and impatient. Teachers remembered him as clever but disruptive. He had no patience for rules. When asked to study, he daydreamed of money, power, and escape. His mother pushed him toward education, hoping he would become a teacher or professional. But Pablo's mind was elsewhere. He was fascinated not by books, but by opportunity. How to bend situations to his advantage, how to make something from nothing. And in Medellín, opportunities, legal or otherwise, were everywhere. Like many boys in the barrios, Pablo started small. He sold old car parts, cigarettes, and stolen tombstones. Yes, tombstones. He and friends would steal them from graveyards, sand them down, and resell them as new. He dealt in fake lottery tickets, tricking desperate people into chasing false luck. He learned how to run petty scams, how to bluff, how to talk his way out of trouble. By his teens, he was already known as a hustler, a boy who could get things done, bend rules, and make money where others saw none. Most teenagers worried about passing exams or finding dates. Pablo Escobar worried about power. By the time he was 16, he had graduated from petty theft to bigger crimes. He organized car theft rings, stripping vehicles for parts or reselling them whole. He carried a gun, not just for protection, but as a statement. There is a famous story, half legend, half truth, and that as a teenager he once told classmates, "I'm going to be president of Colombia," or "I'm going to be the richest man in the world." It sounded like a joke, but for Escobar, it was a mission. Pablo quickly discovered something intoxicating. Crime paid faster than honest work. While his father labored under the sun and his mother taught classrooms of children, Pablo was bringing home more cash than either of them. He wore better clothes, treated his friends, and cultivated a swagger far beyond his years. In neighborhoods where poverty defined life, money brought respect. And respect was something young Escobar craved as much as wealth. To understand Escobar's early years, one must picture Medellín in the 1960s. It was a city of contrasts, industrial growth on one side, sprawling slums on the other. Colombia was politically unstable, with corruption in government and violence between factions. Law enforcement was underpaid, often corrupt, and easy to bribe. For a boy like Pablo, it was a playground. The rules were weak, the system easy to exploit, and ambition could rise unchecked. This environment shaped his worldview. Laws were flexible, power was negotiable, and morality was optional. By his early 20s, Escobar had already moved into more organized operations. He became involved in smuggling contraband cigarettes, appliances, even electronics. Things in demand but expensive due to tariffs and restrictions. Smuggling taught him valuable lessons: supply chains, bribery, negotiation, and the importance of loyalty. He began building connections with local criminals, corrupt officials, and businessmen who benefited from his deals. Step by step, Escobar was no longer just a hustler. He was becoming a player in Medellín's underworld. But Pablo also learned another rule. Violence was sometimes more persuasive than money. Stories spread of him hiring hitmen to eliminate rivals or anyone who stood in his way. Some claim his first murder was committed in his early 20s, when he ordered the death of a local rival over stolen merchandise. Whether myth or fact, one truth was clear. Escobar understood that fear could open doors that money alone could not. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Escobar was at a crossroads. He had money, influence, and a growing reputation in smuggling. But it was not yet enough. He wanted more, much more. And then came the defining opportunity: cocaine. At first, cocaine was barely known outside South America. But Escobar, ever the visionary, saw what others did not. He recognized it as a product that could change everything: lightweight, high demand, and insanely profitable. This was the moment that would transform him from a small-time hustler into the king of cocaine. So the boy who once sold stolen tombstones and fake lottery tickets was now stepping into a business that would make him billions, shake the foundations of Colombia, and capture the attention of the entire world. Pablo Escobar was no longer just a hustler. He was on his way to becoming a legend, one whose empire would soon rival nations. Opportunity is often born out of timing. For Pablo Escobar, the timing could not have been better or worse, depending on how history judges him. By the early 1970s, the world was beginning to discover cocaine. In the nightclubs of Miami, the discos of New York, and the high-end parties of Hollywood, white powder was becoming the new symbol of wealth and rebellion. It was exotic, expensive, and addictive. And Escobar realized what few others did. This was not a fad. This was a revolution. Cocaine was unlike anything Escobar had touched before. Smuggling electronics or cigarettes made good money, but it was bulky, risky, and limited. Cocaine was different, lightweight, easy to hide, and worth its weight in gold once it reached the United States. A single kilo that cost a few $1,000s in Colombia could be sold for tens of thousands in Miami. The profit margins were obscene, and the demand was only growing. Escobar saw the future, and he wanted to control it. At first, the operations were small. Escobar and a few partners would smuggle kilos hidden in suitcases or shipped through private planes. The profits were immediate and staggering. But Escobar was not a man who thought small. If cocaine could make him thousands, why not millions? Why not billions? To achieve that, he needed scale. He needed organization. He needed an empire. Escobar began recruiting. He brought in pilots to fly planes packed with cocaine across the Caribbean. He paid off air traffic controllers to look the other way. He built laboratories deep in the Colombian jungle, where coca leaves were refined into pure powder. And he built an army sicarios, young men from Medellin's poorest neighborhoods, who saw in Escobar a hero, a provider, a man who gave them money, jobs, and purpose. In return, they offered him loyalty and their willingness to kill. This was the foundation of what would soon be called the Medellín Cartel. Escobar was not alone. Other traffickers, Carlos Leder, Jorge Ochoa, José Gonzalo Rodríguez Gacha, joined forces. Together they created a cartel unlike anything the world had ever seen. A cooperative of drug lords who combined resources, routes, and firepower. The Medellín Cartel was born not just as a business, but as a syndicate, with Escobar quickly rising as its most charismatic and feared leader. Soon, the operations grew to industrial proportions. Small planes gave way to large cargo jets. Cocaine was shipped in bulk, hidden in everything from coffee crates to frozen fish. Entire fleets of boats and aircraft were dedicated to the trade. At its peak, the Medellín Cartel was shipping 15 tons of cocaine into the United States every single day. The profits were unimaginable. Estimates suggest the cartel was earning over $60 million a day. That's over $20 billion a year, rivaling the GDP of small countries. Escobar personally was said to be making so much cash that he spent thousands of dollars each month on rubber bands just to bundle the bills. Some money was stored in warehouses, some was buried in fields. Some, legend has it, was eaten by rats before it could be spent. Escobar once admitted they lost millions each year to mold, water damage, or rodents. But it didn't matter. There was always more coming in. Wealth alone wasn't enough for Escobar. He wanted something more: power and love. He poured money into Medellin's poor neighborhoods. He built soccer fields, housing projects, hospitals. He gave cash to families who had nothing. For the poor, Escobar was a savior, the man who gave them what the government never had. They called him El Patron. Mothers prayed for him. Children idolized him. In neighborhoods where the state had failed, Escobar became the state. This image of Robin Hood would shield him for years, even as his empire spread violence. Because make no mistake, violence was not just part of Escobar's business. It was his policy. His motto was simple: plata o plomo, silver or lead. Take the bribe or take the bullet. Judges, police officers, politicians, everyone had a choice. Most took the silver. Those who refused were buried under the weight of lead. It was a chilling efficiency. Bribery when possible, murder when necessary. And in Escobar's Colombia, it worked. By the early 1980s, the Medellín Cartel had gone global. Cocaine wasn't just in Miami anymore. It was in Los Angeles, New York, Paris, Madrid. Escobar's reach extended from South America to North America, Europe, and beyond. The United States declared cocaine the greatest drug epidemic in its history. But no matter how many kilos they seized, more kept coming. Escobar's empire was too vast, too organized, too rich. For a moment, it seemed unstoppable. And at the center of it all was one man, Pablo Escobar, a former car thief turned billionaire kingpin, a man who built a cartel that rivaled governments with an army of loyal soldiers, fleets of planes, and billions in cash. But with power came enemies, and Escobar was about to discover that wealth and fear could buy almost anything except peace. By the early 1980s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a smuggler. He was a billionaire kingpin, a man who could rival governments in wealth, manpower, and influence. But for Escobar, money alone wasn't enough. He wanted legitimacy. He wanted power beyond the underworld. He wanted to be remembered not as a criminal, but as a leader. And so he turned his eyes toward politics. Escobar's empire already reached into every corner of Colombian society. He bribed police officers, paid judges, and bought politicians. But to him, this was still operating from the shadows. What if, he thought, he could step into the light? What if he could walk the halls of government, not as an outlaw, but as a congressman? It seemed outrageous, but with his wealth and popularity among Medellin's poor, it was not impossible. In 1982, Escobar officially entered politics. He ran for a seat in the Colombian Congress. To the surprise of many, he won a position as an alternate congressman. The poor cheered. They saw him as one of their own, a man who built soccer fields and handed out cash, a man who gave them dignity when the government ignored them. For a brief moment, Pablo Escobar looked like he had done the impossible, transforming from criminal overlord to respectable politician. But the illusion couldn't last. Journalists and rivals quickly exposed his criminal ties. One congressman, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, stood up against him, denouncing Escobar as nothing more than a gangster trying to launder his image. Escobar's carefully built facade began to crack. Instead of prestige, politics brought him scrutiny, and scrutiny was something Escobar could not afford. The more Lara Bonilla pushed, the more dangerous the situation became. Escobar had two choices: retreat from politics or silence his enemies. He chose blood. In 1984, Colombia's Minister of Justice, Rodrigo Lara Bonilla, was driving through Bogotá when gunmen on motorcycles pulled up alongside his car. They opened fire, riddling the vehicle with bullets. Lara was killed instantly. The message was clear: Escobar wouldn't tolerate opposition. But this killing had consequences Escobar did not expect. Instead of silencing critics, it ignited the fury of the Colombian government. The state could no longer pretend not to see him. Escobar had declared war, and the government prepared to fight back. Escobar's motto, plata o plomo, silver or lead, spread beyond Medellín. Judges, police officers, journalists, even presidential candidates received the same choice: take the bribe or take the bullet. Some chose money, many chose death. Car bombs exploded in the streets. Airplanes were bombed. Political assassinations shook Colombia to its core. The country was bleeding, and Escobar was at the center of the storm. In 1989, Escobar ordered one of the most shocking acts of terror in Colombian history: the bombing of Avianca Flight 203. A commercial airplane carrying 107 people was blown out of the sky. The target was one man, a presidential candidate who opposed Escobar. But all aboard were killed. The world could no longer look away. Escobar had crossed from drug lord to terrorist. One of Escobar's deepest fears was extradition to the United States. He believed an American prison would be his true end. To him, there was no fate worse than leaving Colombia. So when Colombia signed an extradition treaty with the U.S., Escobar made it his mission to destroy it. His assassins targeted politicians and judges who supported the treaty. His bombs shook Bogotá. His money infiltrated the courts. The message was simple: extradite Escobar, and Colombia would burn. For years, the government wavered, torn between fear of Escobar and pressure from the United States. In that tug of war, Colombia bled. What made Escobar even more dangerous was his dual identity. To the rich and powerful, he was a terrorist. To the poor, he was still a hero. He built housing projects, hospitals, and soccer fields. He handed out envelopes of cash. He paid for funerals, school books, and medical bills. In Medellín, thousands worshipped him. They painted his face on walls, sang his name in songs, and defended him against police raids. For many, Escobar was the only government they had ever known. This paradox made him nearly untouchable. The same man who ordered assassinations of presidents was the man who built playgrounds for children. By the late 1980s, however, Escobar's war was too big to contain. The United States launched Operation Kingpin, working with Colombian forces to target the Medellín Cartel. DEA agents flooded Colombia, bringing technology, training, and resources. Escobar responded with more violence. Judges killed, journalists murdered, politicians bombed. Each act only hardened the resolve of his enemies. Colombia had become a war zone, a nation caught between a billionaire drug lord and the government trying to survive his wrath. By now, Pablo Escobar was no longer a man. He was a state within a state. He had soldiers, politicians, and billions at his command. But every empire built on fear invites its own destruction. And Escobar's power was about to be tested in a way he had never imagined. Because when the government could not capture him, he offered to capture himself. By the early 1990s, Pablo Escobar was no longer just a drug lord. He was the single greatest threat to the Colombian state. His bombs shook Bogotá. His assassins stalked judges and politicians. His money bought loyalty from the poor. But his violence had turned him into a terrorist in the eyes of the world. The United States called him the world's most dangerous man. Colombia called him public enemy number one. And so, the hunt began. Every day in Colombia felt like a gamble. Car bombs exploded in crowded streets. Police officers were gunned down at stoplights. Entire neighborhoods lived under the shadow of Escobar's wrath. The Medellín Cartel wasn't just a criminal organization, it was an army. Thousands of sicarios, many of them barely teenagers, swore loyalty to Escobar. They were paid to kill, paid to plant bombs, paid to terrorize anyone who stood in his way. Escobar didn't just fight the government, he declared war on it. What Escobar feared most was extradition to the United States. He believed dying in Colombia was honorable, but dying in an American prison cell was humiliation. So he unleashed a campaign of terror to force Colombia to end extradition. Politicians who supported the treaty were assassinated. Judges who upheld it were blown apart. The country's Supreme Court was stormed by armed men aligned with drug lords, leaving dozens dead. The message was clear: extradite Escobar, and Colombia would drown in blood. The violence drew global attention. The U.S., Drug Enforcement Administration, the CIA, and American military advisors poured into Colombia. They brought helicopters, intelligence, and training. For the first time, Escobar was not just fighting Colombian police, he was fighting the combined force of two nations. But Escobar was clever. He shifted constantly, moving between safe houses, disguising his movements, hiding in plain sight in Medellín's slums, where thousands would shield him from the police. For every raid, there was a counter-move. For every operation, there was a tip-off. The hunt dragged on, bloody and relentless. Then, in 1991, something astonishing happened. Escobar made a deal with the Colombian government. He offered to surrender. But there was a catch. He would only surrender if he could avoid extradition to the United States. In exchange, he would serve time in a Colombian prison of his own design. The government, exhausted by years of bloodshed and desperate for relief, agreed. And so Escobar went to prison. But La Catedral, the prison Escobar built for himself, was no ordinary prison. Perched on a hillside outside Medellín, it had soccer fields, a bar, a jacuzzi, and even a waterfall. Escobar chose his own guards. He controlled who entered and who left. He hosted guests, held parties, and continued to run the Medellín Cartel from behind its walls. For a time, it seemed absurd. The most powerful drug lord in the world living in a self-made fortress under the name of prison. But Escobar made a fatal mistake. He couldn't resist showing his power. Soon, reports leaked that Escobar was still running his empire, ordering murders, and even torturing rivals inside La Catedral. The Colombian government, humiliated on the world stage, decided to act. In 1992, officials announced they would transfer Escobar to a real prison under government control. But Escobar was always one step ahead. When soldiers surrounded La Catedral, he slipped out through a hidden exit and vanished into the hills. The manhunt was back on. As the government renewed its chase, another force entered the game. Los Pepes short, for perseguidos, por Pablo Escobar. People persecuted by Pablo Escobar. This vigilante group, made up of Escobar's enemies and funded by rival cartels, waged its own bloody campaign. They assassinated his allies, tortured his family members, and burned his properties. Escobar was now trapped between three enemies: the Colombian government, the United States, and Los Pepes. His empire was crumbling. His safe houses were fewer. His money was harder to move. The walls were closing in. For the last year of his life, Escobar lived as a fugitive in his own country. Once the king of Medellín, he was now a man on the run, moving between apartments, disguising himself, relying on dwindling numbers of loyal followers. But even in hiding, he clung to small luxuries. He still spoke to his family on the phone. He still believed he could negotiate, that somehow he could outlast his enemies. But the world had changed. The government was determined. The U.S. was relentless. And Los Pepes showed no mercy. The hunt had started with bombs and car chases, but it was closing in with intelligence, surveillance, and betrayal. Escobar, the man who once ruled Colombia like a king, was now being tracked like prey. And on one December afternoon in 1993, the hunt finally ended, on the rooftop of a Medellín safe house. In 1991, Pablo Escobar shocked the world. After years of bloodshed, after assassinations, bombs, and terror, the most powerful drug lord in history surrendered to the Colombian government. At first glance, it looked like victory. The man who had defied presidents and terrified a nation was finally behind bars. But in truth, Escobar had orchestrated one of the most extraordinary tricks of his career. Because the prison he entered was no prison at all. Escobar knew the government wanted peace. Colombia had been ripped apart by violence, its people exhausted, its leaders desperate. So he made them an offer they couldn't refuse. He would surrender. He would serve time. But on his terms. The key condition: no extradition to the United States. He would remain in Colombia, where he still held power. The government, cornered by years of fear, agreed. And so, Pablo Escobar walked into custody not as a defeated criminal, but as a man who had bent the law to his will. The prison he entered was called La Catedral, but calling it a prison is misleading. Escobar himself had chosen its location, a hilltop outside Medellín, with sweeping views of the valley below. He had overseen its construction, and inside it was more resort than penitentiary. La Catedral had a soccer field, a gym, pool tables, a bar, a waterfall, and even a jacuzzi. Escobar's room looked more like a luxury cabin than a cell. His guards, hand-picked men loyal to him, not the state. From this hilltop fortress, Escobar continued to run his empire. Cocaine shipments still flowed, money still poured in, murders were still ordered. La Catedral was not a cage, it was a headquarters. Escobar's daily life in La Catedral bordered on surreal. He hosted family gatherings, business meetings, and even parties with prostitutes, politicians, and soccer stars. His sicarios came and went freely, carrying out his orders beyond the prison walls. From behind bars, Escobar remained the most powerful man in Colombia. To the outside world, it was an embarrassment. To his followers, it was proof of his invincibility. The people of Medellín still adored him. He built housing, donated to the poor, and reinforced his Robin Hood image. Many believed El Patron had beaten the government at its own game, and for a while, it seemed true. But power breeds arrogance, and arrogance breeds mistakes. In 1992, reports surfaced that Escobar had kidnapped and tortured 2 of his own associates inside La Catedral. They had stolen from him, and he wanted revenge. The Colombian government could no longer pretend the arrangement was working. Internationally, Colombia was a laughingstock. The world saw clearly. The most dangerous man alive was not imprisoned, he was vacationing. Pressure mounted from the United States and Europe to end the charade. The government made a decision. Escobar would be transferred to a real prison, one he didn't control. On July 22, 1992, Colombian soldiers surrounded La Catedral to move Escobar. But Pablo Escobar was never a man to be moved. Some say he had been tipped off. Others believe he had prepared all along. Hidden exits and secret tunnels had been built into the prison, and when the soldiers closed in, Escobar simply walked out. By the time authorities entered, the king was gone. The embarrassment was catastrophic. Colombia had claimed victory over Escobar, only to prove once again that he was untouchable. Escobar's escape reignited the war. The fragile peace was shattered. His enemies rejoiced because this time there would be no more deals, no more negotiations. The government, backed by U.S. intelligence, launched an all-out manhunt, and Escobar found himself hunted not just by the state, but by his rivals, by vigilante groups, and by the very people who once adored him. La Catedral had been his last great illusion of control. Once he left its gates, he entered a world where every shadow could be an enemy, and every day could be his last. Escobar once said he would rather have a grave in Colombia than a cell in the United States. After La Catedral, the first part of that prophecy came true. He would never be extradited. But he had also sealed his fate. No longer a politician, no longer a hero, no longer a man who could play both sides. Pablo Escobar was now a fugitive, stripped of his illusions, running out of places to hide. And so the King of Cocaine descended from his mountain fortress, not to return as a ruler, but to face his final chapter. The hunt was closing in, His allies were dying or betraying him. His fortune, once limitless, was dwindling. And in the end, Pablo Escobar, the man who had commanded armies, bought presidents, and defied the world, would find himself cornered on the rooftop of a Medellín safe house. His empire would die with him. By late 1993, Pablo Escobar's empire was in ruins. The man who once commanded billions, who bribed presidents and terrorized nations, was reduced to a fugitive darting through the alleys of Medellín. His army of sicarios was shrinking. His cartel, once the most powerful in the world, was fractured. His rivals in the Cali cartel were rising. And a new enemy, Los Pepes, a vigilante death squad funded by those rivals, was hunting him with merciless precision. Every day was a survival test. Every night was a gamble. Escobar was still dangerous, but his world was collapsing around him. Escobar had always surrounded himself with power, with soldiers, politicians, admirers, and wealth. But in his final months, that circle evaporated. Many of his closest allies were dead, arrested, or had switched sides. His family lived under constant threat, moving from safe house to safe house. His fortune, once limitless, was now scattered and hard to access. Even the neighborhoods that once worshipped him as a Robin Hood had grown weary of blood and bombs. The man who once ruled Medellín was now hiding within it. On December 2nd, 1993, Escobar turned 44. He spent the day in hiding, eating cake with his family. The next day, he made a critical mistake. Despite knowing the government was tracking his communications, Escobar couldn't resist calling his son. He spoke for minutes, too many minutes. The call was traced. A joint task force of Colombian police, supported by U.S. intelligence, moved swiftly. They had been chasing shadows for months, but now they had a location. A modest safe house in a middle-class neighborhood of Medellín. The police surrounded the house in the afternoon. Escobar, realizing the trap, tried to flee. He and his bodyguard, Álvaro de Jesús Agudelo, nicknamed El Limón, rushed out the back and scrambled onto the rooftops. Gunfire erupted. Escobar, heavier now, clumsy from years of luxury, struggled to run across the tiles. Bullets ripped through the air. El Limón was hit first, collapsing. Escobar fired back with a pistol, but he was outnumbered. Seconds later, he was struck. Bullets tore into his leg, his torso, and finally, his head. Pablo Escobar fell face down on the red tiles of a Medellín rooftop. Blood spread beneath him, soaking into the clay. The King of Cocaine was dead. Colombian police officers posed for photos with his body. For the government, it was proof of victory. For his enemies, it was justice. For his followers, it was heartbreak. In Medellín, thousands of mourners poured into the streets for his funeral. Some wept openly, calling him a saint. Others celebrated, relieved that the years of terror were over. The world looked on in fascination. The man who had once been listed on Forbes's Billionaire list, the man who defied nations, had died not in a palace, but on a rooftop, hunted and cornered like prey. Think of the irony. Escobar had billions, yet died with a cheap pistol in his hand. He controlled armies, yet was running with only one bodyguard. He once dreamed of ruling Colombia, even becoming its president. Yet in the end, he was a fugitive with no allies. The contrast was staggering. The man who had once declared himself untouchable proved, in the end, to be as mortal as anyone else. But death did not erase Escobar. His name endures both in legend and in warning. To some Colombians, he remains a folk hero, the man who gave back to the poor when the government turned away. His housing projects still stand, his soccer fields still echo with children's laughter. To others, he is a scar on history, a terrorist who bombed airplanes, murdered judges, and left tens of thousands dead. His violence scarred a nation and destroyed countless lives. In popular culture, Escobar has become larger than life, inspiring books, movies, series, and endless fascination. He is the archetype of the modern drug lord, wealthy, brutal, charismatic, and doomed. But beyond the myth lies the lesson. One power built on fear is fragile. Escobar ruled through terror, but terror turned the world against him. Wealth without peace is meaningless. He had billions, but he could not buy safety, loyalty, or freedom. 3. No one is untouchable. Escobar defied governments, but in the end, it was a simple phone call that gave him away. 4. Crime always destroys its creators. Escobar's empire burned bright, but it burned out fast, leaving only ashes behind. So, who was Pablo Escobar? A Robin Hood? A terrorist? A businessman? A monster? The truth is that he was all of these at once. He was a man of contradictions, capable of generosity and cruelty, of building and destroying, of love for his family and indifference to the lives of strangers. His story is not just Colombian history. It is a universal story, a reminder of what happens when ambition crosses the line into obsession, when power becomes addiction, when fear becomes currency. Escobar's life rose like a rocket and fell like a stone. And in the end, the image that remains is simple. A man lying face down on a rooftop, his empire gone, his dream shattered, his legend sealed.